Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues of Eugene and Parker. Welcome this morning as we remember this incredible figure, a wonderful colleague, fellow astrophysicist Gene. I'm Angela Linto. I'm an astrophysicist and a colleague and a friend, and currently the Dean of the Physical Sciences Division. I will be welcoming those who will be speaking, and my first introduction is to our provost, Kai Lee. She is the David Lee Schilling-Law Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Chemistry, the James Franck Institute, the Institute for Biophysical Dynamics, and the college. So welcome, Kai.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you who gather here today in the Bond Chapel, as well as those of you who are joining us from afar via live stream, to be here to celebrate the life and the work of Gene Parker. Today, we have the honor of celebrating a pioneering astrophysicist and his many remarkable contributions, which include proposing the concept of the solar wind some 65 years ago in 1957, receiving the Crawford Award Prize by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and having NASA's landmark solar mission named after him, with the Parker Solar Probe being the first NASA spacecraft named after a living person. It is really gratifying that Gene actually had the opportunity to see the data collected from the mission, which we'll hear a little bit more later this morning. In true UChicago spirit and fashion, Gene's research was groundbreaking. It was initially maybe too revolutionary to be accepted, and later on only be proven to be completely correct. His work actually has reshaped our picture and our understanding of space and the solar system. And he went on to revolutionize the field of astrophysics, unraveling the complex physics that is behind magnetism and magnetic field in space and the dynamics of plasma. Gene's many contributions to the university and to the fields of astronomy and astrophysics had a lasting impact both on campus and in our world. And we are more than grateful to have him as a colleague in our academic community. I very much look forward to hearing the stories about Gene's personal and professional life, and I really thank you all for being here today to honor his memory.
It is a pleasure to, invite some of the wonderful memories that we will be hearing. Many of you have the program, but I will let you know who's coming on the next round. So we'll have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Joyce Parker, Gene's daughter, then followed by Eric Parker, Gene's son, then Owen Lowe, and Gene's grandson. And then following that, Canaris Tsinganas sent his memories recorded, and then we'll hear from Tom Bogdan, Gene's former PhD students, sharing some memories on behalf of other former postdocs and students. So thank you so much, Dr. Joyce Parker, please.
Thank you all for coming. To describe my father as a highly decorated theoretical physicist might conjure up an image of an absent-minded professor with his head in the clouds and someone with a prodigious talent in a narrow area, but that's not who my father was. He was grounded, he had many interests and talents, and he was a family man. And so today we're trying to celebrate all those aspects of his life. Myself, growing up, I was not really aware of his stature as a physicist. He didn't work much when he got home on the weekends or in the evenings. And later, when I attended U of C myself and I saw him both at work and at home, I realized that he had a little switch in his brain that toggled between work mode and home mode, and he flipped that switch somewhere on the commute home so that when he arrived home, he was simply a husband and a father. And he did typical father things with us. He played with us when we were little. He read to us, not just when we were little, until I was 12 or 13. And I still gravitate towards the rhythmic poems of A.A. Milne and things like They're Changing Guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. He helped us with our homework. He attended all of our events, even the most minor ones. But besides these typical things, he did some more unusual things. He taught me some rudimentary carpentry. Before I was allowed to drive the family car alone, I had to be able to change a tire. I helped change the oil and the spark plugs. And then there were the things that we did at my grandparents' farm in the Ozarks. I think of this as my pioneer upbringing. I had to shoot a gun, the idea being that if I knew how to handle a gun, I wouldn't be afraid of guns. That didn't really work. In order to appreciate where our food came from, we had to see one of my grandparents' cattle being slaughtered. Fortunately for us, it was a small, humane operation, and I could still eat meat. I had to learn to drive a tractor, and that was put to the test one day when we were up the mountain behind the house with a load of logs on the trailer, and my dad said I should drive the tractor down. And my grandfather said, keep it in first gear, the engine will hold you back. It was an old, worn-out Ford tractor. The clutch was worn out, and it tended to pop out of gear. So I had to keep one hand on the gear shift at all times to keep it in gear. I used the other hand to steer, and I started down the mountain, and I did pretty well at first. But then we got to the steep part, and it did pop out into neutral. We started to pick up speed, and tractors have 2 brake pedals so that the wheels can be controlled independently. And my foot was just big enough to span those 2 pedals. So that's what I did. I put my foot across the pedals, put all my weight on that leg, and I stopped the rig. My grandfather drove the rest of the way down. I've never driven a tractor since. I certainly don't slaughter my own food, and I don't own a gun. I change spark plugs only on things like chainsaws and lawnmowers. But my parents taught me something else, more important than those individual skills, and that was a sort of self-reliance, an ability to solve in the real world and make things happen. And I brought that to my marriage, and my husband and I spent many, many happy hours doing projects around the house, making it a home. And now that I'm a widow, I can still maintain my house myself, or if I need tradesmen, I hope that I am knowledgeable enough not to get hoodwinked. And so I'm very grateful to what my parents taught me and to the love and affection that came with it. Thank you.
I'm Eric. For those of you that are into sports betting, the FanDuel odds on me getting through this without choking up are plus 500. For those of you that aren't, that means it's 5-1 against. But as Joyce just put it, our dad was first and foremost to us, our dad. From our first memories of him until his last day, that didn't change. He set an example for us, and I'm not talking about science because that was in the background. Like Joyce said, he switched that off at home. But the example that our parents set for us included, don't be fussy people. The phrase, it won't kill you. You'll live. Those were every day in our lives, I think. Fussiness is not a Parker thing. They were gracious and caring. They were confident in their abilities. Family was absolutely first. But close behind serve-sufficiency, like Joyce said, and frugality, they kept their sense of humor and they never took themselves too seriously. Frequently, they took themselves not too seriously. They avoided drama. And being low-key, it went without saying. For instance, in early May of 2017, I was having lunch with my parents at their house in Flossmoor. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw my dad kind of flinch and look at my mom, and she returned his look with a glare, and he was confused. And then all of a sudden, he understood the kick in the shin signal that he had just gotten. And he said, well, Eric, I guess there's something I need to tell you. And my heart went in my throat. I knew my dad had Parkinson's disease. He had had Lyme disease. And I just thought, oh, God, what now? But he continued. He says, Thomas Zurbuchen, a guy I knew at NASA, gave me a call the other day. And he asked if it would be okay if NASA would rename an upcoming mission to the sun after me. And I said, and? He said, oh, I said that would be fine. And we chatted for a few minutes. And then I hung up and I thought, did I hear that right? You know, my hearing's not too good. I'll say. But he said, then I thought, no. We talked about the Solar Probe Plus and renaming it as Parker Solar Probe. So I must have heard it right. And at that point, my mom interjected, I think it would be really great if the family could go and actually see the launch in person. And my dad immediately, oh no, NASA wouldn't want us down there. We'd just be in the way. So at the end of the month, end of May in 2017, there was the official renaming press conference here at U of C. And my wife Susan and I were sitting next to Steve Meyer and his wife Sharon. And Steve leans over to me and says, hey, you guys know this is a big effing deal, right? He said, and if you want proof, I've never seen this many physicists in suits. Well, a couple moments later, we learned that at that point, there had been, I think, about only 22 missions named after people. And we thought, oh, wow. And then a minute later, we learned, not going to lose that bet yet, this was the first to be named after a living person. Dad had low-keyed that one. He neglected to mention that. Then again, in January of 2020, I got a text from Nikki Fox saying, somebody's trying to get in touch with your dad, and could they call you? And then in parentheses, the text said, possible prize? So I texted back, sure, have them call me. And in a few minutes, I got a call from somebody at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences saying, we've just awarded the 2020 Crawford Prize for Astronomy to your father. I immediately called Joyce. And together, we called our dad and got him on the phone. And by this time, his hearing was awful. And we said, hey, Dad, have you heard of the Crawford Prize? And he says, well, of course. And we said, well, Dad, you just won it. And he muttered something, and then he said, well, that's great. You tell them congratulations. And then Joyce and I shouted to him over the phone, no, Dad, you just won it. And for the first time I think either of us can remember, he was speechless for a good moment. Then he said, cover your ears, Lena, I'll be damned. His surprise was genuine. His modesty was Parker. So another part of the example that our parents set was, as I mentioned, frugality. Parkers are frugal. That's an understatement. Our mom grew up in Rotterdam, in occupied Rotterdam during the war. Our dad went through the Depression, and his mother was of Scottish descent, and I don't know which was the bigger factor. But we didn't go in for a lot of fancy stuff. We didn't have fine crystal. Our pots and pans were Revere ware. Nobody had a fur. The family car was a bare bones Plymouth. I had clip-on ties until I was in college. And when it came time we needed a little cart to roll our little sailboat down to the beach in Michigan. We didn't buy one. We made one. And we made it out of old parts from my soapbox derby car, including the plywood wheels that we made. Frugal is a Parker thing, as is a sense of humor. This April, Joyce and Miles and Michelle and Susan and I and Nikki were at the Crawford Prize Awards ceremony, which was actually 3 years worth thanks to COVID putting everything off. And I was honored to accept the prize from my dad. And there was a big award dinner afterward. The laureates and Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden. Well, as we were waiting to parade in, the laureates and I and Crown Princess Victoria were off in a little vestibule, and we were chatting. And I had referred to myself as the faux laureate. Well, Andy Knoll, this year's 2022 Crawford Prize winner for geosciences, says, oh, Eric, you're not the faux laureate. And I said, Andy, you guys actually won the award. I am here among you solely because of my DNA. And at that point, Crown Princess Victoria says nothing, but looks at us and says, and I thought, oh my God, I have literally just made a royal foot in the mouth gaffe. And then she smiled and laughed, and we joined in, and Dad would have loved that. I did. Save my bacon. So anyway, as Joyce and I have learned late in life, our dad was a pretty good physicist. But to us, we were just feeling lucky to be blessed with such a great set of parents. I like to tell people, we chose our parents well. Dr. Lowe.
Hi everyone, my name is Owen. I'm one of 3 grandkids. So I spent a lot of time over the last week thinking about how best to describe the way that I viewed him, especially growing up when I was younger. And you know, in thinking about how to do this, especially concisely, what I arrived at, I don't think does his full character justice, but I do think it does a decent job of, again, describing how I personally viewed him. So those of you that watch TV might recall a few years ago there was a series of commercials which featured the most interesting man in the world. And these were funny commercials. They're lighthearted, but in all seriousness, I actually think that does describe a lot of what I thought about him when I was growing up. So I just wanted to share a few examples of what sort of contributed to this image in my mind. So in no particular order, he and our grandmother loved to travel. They touched all 7 continents throughout their travels. But 2 trips that really stood out in my mind that they took us on. One, they took us to Costa Rica. They were celebrating their, I guess that was their 50th wedding, 50th, 60th wedding anniversary. And you know, Costa Rica is it's a kind of like a resort destination, right? You see these beautiful beaches and all of this. I don't think we ever spent more than about 10 minutes relaxing in a resort on that whole trip. Instead, we climbed in this tiny high-winged aircraft. We landed it in this landing strip in the middle of the jungle. We got in boats, rode them down this river with monkeys swinging overhead. We were riding horses. We were looking for poison dart frogs. So not your typical, tropical vacation. They also took us to Nepal. We hiked the foothills of the Himalayas with a team of Sherpas as our guide. We rode elephants through a game reserve. We saw a tiger in the wild. Again, we got in an airplane. We flew around Mount Everest to see it from close up. So my point here is not that they took us on, exotic vacations. But I think what really stuck in my mind, and especially, in the context of why we're here today, seeing this guy who was, I guess, in that time, probably mid-70s, he'd already experienced a lot, right? But seeing him just really soak up these new places and seeking to understand these new places, he was interested in the geology, the wildlife, the history, the politics, all of it. And I have to imagine this drive to understand the world around him has to have contributed to his professional success as well. In that case, seeking to understand the universe around him, not just the world around him. But again, I think it was something that was likely pervasive, throughout his life. Another example, when we would visit our grandparents either at their house in Chicago or in the summer, their place on Lake Michigan, I always looked forward to happy hours. So in the afternoon, we would hang out out on the porch or in the living room. We'd have cheese and crackers and drinks. He always had a tall glass of apple juice because he never touched alcohol. But he always had sort of endless stories. And one of his favorite topics was explorers. In particular, there were 2 guys who were, I guess, racing to be the first to reach the South Pole. And it's not just that he had, casually read an article about them and he was telling us about this. He had really studied this. He knew what provisions they brought. He knew all this stuff about them. And explorer stories aside, again, I was always a little suspicious, or I always wondered, I don't think you can spend that amount of calories thinking about something like this without also spending a little time imagining yourself in the shoes of these explorers. So again, I think this was sort of this adventurous spirit of his, shining through in his personal interest. So one more example, so I don't run over here. When he was a kid, he was a teenager, he and his brother bought a plot of land hundreds of miles from their suburban Detroit home. They rode their bikes there. They built a cabin there with their bare hands, and that cabin is still standing there today. And I can distinctly remember, my Uncle Eric had brought me there. I distinctly remember laying in a bunk bed in that cabin, staring up and just wondering, how the heck did these guys pull this off? I thought it was cool I was allowed to ride my bike to the next neighborhood over, to my friend's house. and here's what they were doing at this same age. So again, I think it was this adventurous spirit that was sort of pervasive throughout his life that I have to imagine, contributed to some of his professional contributions as well. So, thinking ahead to how I will describe him to my kids, to my grandkids, I'll be sure to try to describe, that spirit and all the beautiful places it can take you. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity for this short 7-minute tribute to Gene Parker, who was my teacher, a mentor, a colleague, and a scientist, and at the same time representing his 14 graduate students. To even mention his 446 papers and 4 books is impossible, but I would make some short remarks how I see my PhD supervisor, Eugene Parker. First of all, I believe that Gene Parker belongs to the pantheon of giant scientists for the following reason. Around 4 centuries ago, Kepler described the laws that govern the motion of the planets around the sun. 77 years later, Newton was the one who explained Kepler's law by adopting the law of gravitation. However, in the space between the planets, there was nothing. It was vacuum. Parker came 350 years ago after Kepler and 270 years after Newton to fill this gap and explain that between the planets there is lots of material which is coming from the sun, namely billions, about million of photons per second are ejected from the sun in the form of the solar wind. So this is the famous paper of Gene in 1957, and Parker's theory of the solar wind remains today as one of the most beautiful chapters of modern astrophysics, both for its simplicity and for the plausible and wonderful way of explaining a not so simple physical phenomenon. Today, we have many similar outflows from young stars, from microquasars, planetary nebulae, neutron stars, radio galaxies, and even gamma-ray bursts. The solar wind is the prototype of astrophysical MHD flows, and the case of collimated magnetized astrophysical MHD flows is a consequence which we, the students of Parker, have explored. Now, let me go quickly to some of Parker's contributions at textbook level. It is the Parker dynamo, 1955, the Parker magnetic buoyancy and the formation of sunspots, 1955 too, the Parker instability in the interstellar medium in 1957, Parker's famous theorem for the non-equilibrium of non-symmetric magnetic fields, 1972. Parker explored also the physics of magnetic flux tubes in 1979. It's remarkable, actually, that he proposed a new theory for the sunspots that is a conglomeration of magnetic flux tubes. In this year, 1979, Parker published 8 papers in the Astrophysical Journal, and we published also a paper together about the physics of the magnetic flux tubes. Altogether, this year, 1979, Gene Parker published more than 20 papers. I should mention also the Parker bound for the magnetic monopole, the sweet Parker reconnection mechanism, 1957, the Parker transport equation for the propagation of cosmic rays in the heliosphere in 1958, which is the major tool for understanding cosmic ray propagation. The Parker shape of the heliosphere, which was observed by Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, is another possibility, another case. All in all, Gene Parker discovered the individual links in the long chain of solar MHD. The dynamo process inside the sun produces the magnetic fields, magnetic buoyancy produces sunspots, currents in loops produce the hot corona, and in the cradle, as we say, of the solar wind, is the place which the solar wind starts. According to the NASA ADS, Gene has published 446 papers and 4 books with 29,000 citations. Perhaps the solar wind work overshadowed several of his other almost equally important works. But it is impossible actually here to mention all of these important papers. In closing, I would like to mention that we were 14 PhD students. I completed my degree in 1980, and there were other important PhD theses, as you can see in this transparency. Here in this picture, for example, is Bunchai Low during the IAU Symposium on Magnetic Fields in Heidelberg, chatting with Gene Parker. In this picture, which was taken during 1987, we are 4 students of Gene Parker, and this picture is from his paper reminiscing my 60-year pursuit of the solar wind, of the physics of the sun and the galaxy. In 2017, again, I was in Chicago, and here in this picture, Gene is together with Bob Rosner and Thanasis Economou. Some pictures from his visits to Greece. Gene visited several times Greece for collaboration, for talks, for also participating in a meeting that I organized in his honor. In the last picture here is Gene with Nisi after crossing the Samaria Gorge, which was quite an achievement. And this is the meeting I mentioned that I organized in 1995 to honor Gene Parker at Fo, the birthplace of the Cretan painter El Greco. In finishing, I would like to say that we, Gene students, can only repeat what Alexander the Great said about 2,300 years ago about his teacher. I owe my life to my father, but the dignity of my life to my teacher. So, although Gene Parker is no longer with us, his revolutionary discoveries and legacy will live forever, because his main contributions on plasma astrophysics and heliophysics can be discovered only once. This is a remark which I made in the 44th COSPAR General Assembly in Athens last July 2022, where Parker was leading the scientific organizing committee of the session exploring the cradle of the solar wind with a Parker Solar Probe, Solar Orbiter, and Proba 3. What do we really know about the solar corona? I feel blessed to do my PhD with Gene Parker, and thank you very much for your attention.
Ian Lurch sends his sincere regrets that he cannot be here with you all today. He had an operation yesterday, and he thought the odds of being up for a transatlantic flight were probably not high. So he asked me to come up here and read those remarks to you, and that's what I'm going to do. Just maybe 2 comments about Ian for those of you who don't know him. Ian was born in August 1941 in Northumberland, and he grew up in Whitley Bay near Cullerscote, made famous by a Dire Straits song, their suburbs of Newcastle upon Tyne. He went to do his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Manchester, starting in 1959 and ending in 1965. And there he already developed a reputation for what we might call a tremendous amount of pluck, because he is probably the only person that I know of who turned down an offer to do his PhD at Cambridge with Sir Fred Hoyle. But he didn't turn down coming to Chicago to work with Gene, and that's where our story begins. Amongst the offers from the USA was one that really intrigued me, a postdoc position with Eugene Parker at the University of Chicago. Gene had sent along a couple articles he had just finished, including his now world-famous diffusion-convection equation for bulk transport of cosmic rays. And Gene wrote, "I'm taking the liberty of sending you a couple papers that I think you might find interesting." I wanted to work with Gene, but I was used to the English system, where one worked for a professor and not with a professor. So I wrote back to Gene and said I would love to take the position, but only if I could have time to work out a few ideas of my own. Back came a very puzzled letter that said, "But that's precisely why I'm hiring you." I figured that I could indeed work under such conditions, and I accepted the one-year postdoc in Chicago that paid 6 times what I would have received in England. My first year as a postdoc was almost done, and so I started sending out letters for another job. I got offers from England, of course, but the pay was abysmally low that there was no way I could afford to go back. Indeed, one offer said that I would be paid £2,000 per year, commensurate with the age of 26. I showed the letter to Gene. He asked what it meant. I told him that 26 is the age and that would be the salary you would get for it. Gene asked, "What if one had a Nobel Prize at age 26? I grinned and said, "If you are 26, that will be the salary." Gene wandered off, looking amazingly dazed at this quaint stupidity. Fortunately, I received an offer from Chicago to stay on as an assistant professor for another 3 years, which relieved the immediate crisis and meant I could concentrate on the half-formed problems in my head. One of the more scientifically amusing incidents occurred in the winter of 1968 at the Texas Astrophysics meeting that was, of course, held in New York that year. Gene had given a talk on solar magnetic field and its interactions with the planets as it swept outward by the solar wind. At the end of the talk, Tommy Gold stood up and commenced to try to denigrate the work with a fairly long diatribe. Gene stood patiently at the podium for a while and then commented, "Let's see now, Tommy. You have presumably worked out quantitatively these fascinating ideas." Tommy allowed us to know he had not done so, at which point Gene smiled slightly and said, "Oh dear, what a pity." The audience collapsed laughing because Tommy Gold was well known for having lots of ideas, arguing eloquently for the ideas, but never working out any of them. If someone else worked them out and they were correct, then Tommy would claim credit. If they failed, well, Tommy would be mute. Most of the time, quantitative investigation uncovers some subtle flaw in the assumptions made, or shows that the effect one is so enthusiastic about is so small that one can ignore it. With the knowledge of tenure in the late 1960s came the idea of buying a house, for I had then a steady, virtually uninterruptible income. The southern suburbs of Chicago provided good access by train to the inner part of the city and the university. The school system in the dormitory town of Homewood was fairly good. So, with a family now of 3 daughters, we bought a house there. We did not have too much to move, but still almost filled a rental truck. Gene, of course, came over to help us move. He pulled our seed trunk out of the truck, placed it on his back using one arm, and said, "Where do you want it set down?" My eyes boggled in amazement. That sea trunk had held all of our belongings on the way over from England. Its volume was about 12 cubic feet, heavier than sin, when empty. And I had filled it with tools, electrical supplies, paint cans, and other items I knew I would need immediately at move-in. I could hardly move the trunk so late, and there was Gene with this monstrous weight on his back. Recovering somewhat my poise, I said to Gene, "Holy cow, Gene, that thing is enormously heavy." Clearly a very profound statement. Gene smiled patiently and remarked, "Yes, I know. That's why I want you to tell me where to put it down. And now would be good." So began my daily commute from Homewood to the university by train, and that was to carry on almost unbroken until the fall of 1977. The train provided an ideal environment to work in relative peace for 2 extra hours per day. I used to write my papers longhand on the train and then get them typed. I was reviewing an article one day on the train, working through another author's mathematics on a block of paper. Gene's wife was sitting next to me, and she suddenly remarked, "Ian, that's not one of your papers." I looked up, asked her how she knew. With a wicked little grin on her face, she said, "There's not enough gobbledygook for it to be one of yours." This short compendium of Parker stories is just an overview of my long 15 years of interaction with Gene Parker, both scientifically and personally. While I have concentrated here mainly on Gene, I must tell you the friendship of Nisha, his wife, and the kids, Joyce and Eric, is something that I will always treasure. I could wax poetic about their help, but I fear my time is more than done. But never fear, I write limericks once in a while, particularly when I am stuck on a problem, and I sent the following limerick to Gene. A scientist by the name of Parker bought a car but could not start her. So he filled her with wind from the sun, and now she does run, but he still can't find a place to park her. I sure will miss Gene. We stayed in contact all the years after Chicago, almost until his death. Requiescat in pace, old friend.
We will now hear from colleagues and friends of Gene's, starting with Steve Meyer, Professor Emeritus in the Departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Physics, the Enrico Fermi Institute, and the college, and a longtime friend of Gene, who's unable to be here today but is sharing his memories remotely. Then we'll hear from Bob Rosner, the William Rother Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Physics, the Enrico Fermi Institute, the Harris School of Public Policy, and the college, a longtime friend and colleague of Gene's, and Nikki Fox, or Nicola Fox, the director of the NASA Heliophysics Division and a colleague of Gene on the Parker Solar Probe, and a very good friend of many of us. So I'll start with the video, please.
I've known Gene for my entire life. My father, Peter Meyer, and Gene were colleagues and friends since the mid-1950s when Gene arrived in Chicago. The Parkers, Gene, Nisha, Joyce, and Eric, and my family spent quite a bit of time together. Thanksgiving and New Year's celebrations, as well as many happy weekends in their cabin on Lake Michigan. I very much enjoyed those times, and as a younger child, the Michigan cabin was the best. They had a sailboat on the lake, and we all got to go sailing in it to my delight. Even as a kid, Gene was an adult I could talk to. We would usually start with about how sailboats worked and go on from there about anything. But the fascinating thing for me about Gene was the carved wooden figures that he made. Now, in most things, Gene was a pretty straight guy. He didn't go for nonsense. He kept pretty constant schedule, turning off the problems from work when he was home. He didn't drink. He drove at 60 miles an hour max on the interstate, even outside of the Carter years. But his carvings told a different story. From my father, I inherited a wooden troll that Gene carved. It's about 1.5 feet high and has only one eye. The pupil is a deep hole painted black on the inside, and a pretty good-sized hook nose, and is striding towards you with one arm behind its back and a distinctly otherworldly look in its one eye. I've often wondered how this creature came out of that man. Besides the troll in the Michigan cabin was a whole menagerie of other creatures and slightly unnerving carvings. A wall lamp holder in the shape of a full-size, muscular human arm coming out of the wall, placed in a neat frame as though it was an elk head. A 20-foot-long snake mounted on the ceiling. Alligators, strange faces. Wow. Another distinct memory is that Gene loved the forest. He would take anyone who wanted to join on walks through the woods in the dune country around the cabin. There were only animal trails, but he knew every hill and every hollow. About 3/4 of the mile from the cabin was a sand mining company that was working its way through the forest near Interstate 196. While the site was not pleasing to look at, we would still go there because it was a great place to jump off the tops of half-carried-away dunes. You could easily jump down 20 feet onto the steep, sliding sand. As long as you landed at a different spot each time, it was a soft landing after an exhilarating leap. Usually, Gene jumped the furthest of anyone. Yet another side of Gene was his reputation for being a hard teacher and tough on students. I'm absolutely sure that he expected of the students only what he expected of himself. I'm probably lucky I was never on the receiving end of his classes. His expectations would likely have been a problem for me. Exacting expectations define much of how Gene worked in science and at university as well. It had a big effect on all those around him. He was chair of 2 departments at different times. His style of leadership in these situations was straightforward, clear of purpose, and to great effect. His scientific work was also of the kind where his clear and straight thinking about a complicated system led to breakthroughs in the understanding of the sun's surface and interplanetary space. I've had the great good fortune to have known Gene over many years. He was a good friend, and I will miss him.
There are many reasons that I stand here today to speak about Gene Parker. Let me start by speaking about his science. Much of my own science career has focused on problems that Gene was instrumental in defining. He was, after all, the founder of the discipline of plasma astrophysics, a discipline in which I've spent most of my career. And it was his leadership in this field that convinced me to come to the University of Chicago, and Gene is really, in large part, responsible for why I'm here. Jean saw the sun as a touchstone of astrophysical theory. That is, that nature had given us an exemplar to study the physics of stars and placing it within our reach. And now we're literally reaching and touching the sun with the aptly named Parker Solar Probe, about which we'll hear more about shortly. Jean also had a very particular style of doing astrophysics. Jean often started from an intuition about how something really worked, and then enlisted the mathematics needed to allow a theoretical account of the phenomenon. I think there's a connection there to the way he looked at doing things in general, including his carving. His work on the solar dynamo, I think, was really exemplary in this regard. Not only did his calculations capture much of the essential regularities of the solar magnetic cycle, but it turned out his model equations could be derived after much effort from first principles. It is rather typical that Jean just got there much earlier, simply based on his powerful intuition. He simply had amazingly powerful intuitions on how complex astrophysical systems work. He was also a really original thinker, and by that I mean that he chose problems that others had given up on, or that he approached in an entirely original manner, or even one that no one else had thought of as a problem in the first place. For example, his use of hydrodynamics rather than particle physics to attack mass loss from the sun, inventing the solar wind. His insight that symmetry breaking was the key to finally getting around the anti-dynamo theorem of Thomas Cowling. His work connecting topological instabilities of magnetic fields to what are now referred to as nanoflares heating the solar corona. These are all examples of his inventiveness and intellectual leadership, and he was fearless, never intimidated by other so-called experts. I think that anecdote about Tommy Gold was just perfect. Jean's career also spanned a remarkable transition in theoretical physics and astrophysics as computer modeling and simulations became more and more dominant. Yet he never succumbed to the temptation. Instead, because of his remarkable applied mathematical talents, Jean continued throughout his long career to carry out breakthrough science without resorting to computer simulations, instead reaching breakthrough physics insights using classical analytical analyses guided by his intuitions on how things really work. It also needs to be said that Jean cared deeply about the science community that he was part of, a kind of a parent figure. He played a huge role on the national level in making sure that this community thrived. For example, he was an early supporter of what, some 30 years ago, was at times humorously referred to as the Solar Plunger mission, aiming to understand the physics of the solar corona. The NASA mission, of course, that's now named the Parker Solar Probe. And I recall that starting in the early 1980s, he was instrumental in pushing for a resolution-limited, ground-based optical and infrared telescope to study the sub-arc-second fine structure of the magnetic field on the solar surface, which is now realized as the National Science Foundation funded 4-meter class Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope, which we call DKIST, which was in fact dedicated just a month and a half ago in Hawaii. And we tried to get him there, but that didn't work out. However, while he was able to see the launch of the probe, it is too bad. I will always regret that he didn't get to see the telescope, but we were able to show him some of the results, the high-resolution images of solar magnetic fine structures that he had been looking forward to for over 40 years. It's really quite something. So allow me to end by speaking briefly about Jean Parker, the person. He was selfless in giving advice to his colleagues. He never shut his door, was always ready to call out, "Come on in," when somebody knocked on his office door. In my case, I got advice on science problems, starting from my first personal encounter, which was a bit fearful, He was visiting Cambridge, and I was a lowly assistant professor. And he also gave advice on dealing with life, including academic life. So, for example, I took to heart 2 very pithy suggestions he had for me when I became chair of astronomy. Bob, try to spend as little time as possible in the chair's office, since otherwise the staff will surely find things for you to do that will occupy all of your time. There's a lesson there for you guys. Bob, you might find it useful to conduct much of the department's business while walking from the chair's office to your own office. I took that advice. As you can intuit from these suggestions, and I think what you've heard earlier, Gene wasn't much interested in idle chatting about anything, especially academic politics. Not that he didn't take administrative matters seriously. Quite the contrary. He was wise in dealing with departmental business, sage in his advice, always clear thinking, pithy and to the point, really to the point. But he really loved talking about science. And it didn't matter whether it was related to his own work or not. He just loved it. So I think you might well guess correctly that I miss Gene enormously. He was a gem of a person, and he was a gem of a scientist. And it was really tough to lose him.
Good morning. It seems only fitting that the first time I ever met Gene Parker, I was standing at a podium at the University of Chicago with a stash of Kleenex. Today, I'm doing the same. As Eric already told you, we renamed the mission on May 31st, 2017. And I was supporting that event, and my job was to talk about the mission, the technology, and the science, and introduce the key science team members that were there. That was the easy bit. The hard part for me was I had to tee up a video. And it was a video I had seen many times before, but this time it was different. Previously, the video said, NASA's Solar Probe Plus will da-da-da. For the very first time, the world would hear NASA's Parker Solar Probe. The tears flooded. It didn't matter how many times I watched it the night before, the emotion was huge. As Eric noted, it was the first time that NASA had ever named a mission after a person during their own lifetime. And moreover, that person was sitting a few feet away from me. Hence the overflow of emotion. Now, few people actually realize the real significance of this event. NASA has named missions for people before, about 22 times, but we'd never done it when someone was still alive. I'd worked on a mission previously, it was on the radiation belts, and the science team had clamored for years to have this mission named for James Van Allen. Eventually, NASA did make that change, but sadly Jim had passed and he never got to see his Van Allen probes flying. The big change for us was we had a force at NASA headquarters that was actually not afraid to change a paradigm and push for this to happen. That person, of course, is Thomas Zurbuchen, my boss, and he really understood the profound need to do this. There are about 50 NASA missions that are directly derived from Gene Parker's work. So if anyone deserved this honor, it was Dr. Eugene Parker. Now, I was, trying to prepare for this yesterday, and I found myself, I knew everybody would have talked about the tremendous science that Gene did. So I found myself reading some of the newspaper articles that came out, particularly shortly before the launch. And one is a beautiful one from the Chicago Tribune, and I'd actually forgotten doing this interview. And as I was reading it, it was making me smile because I say things like, he's the father of the mission. It's his paper, his science, his ingenuity that told us about how wonderful the corona is, and 60 years later, we're going to go visit it. And I thought, obviously true. But right below there, I read the words, but Gene Parker wasn't much for fanfare. And it goes on to say that this writer had visited Gene in his home, and he notes that the only sign of this great honor was a small pile of coaster-sized stickers, NASA stickers, bearing the words Parker Solar Probe. And of course, Gene proffered these to the report. Please take one, it's lovely. And so, he then goes on to say something like, I was really honored that NASA named the mission for me, but honestly, I'm not doing anything for it. I didn't, it's the engineers that really deserve the credit, and they don't get these newspaper articles. And that made me cry again, because it reminded me of this wonderful day in October of 2017, where Gene came to visit us at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where the mission was built, and I was there at the time as the project scientist. I actually wrote to Gene, and I asked him if he would come to this meeting. And I kid you not, he responded with the words, "Well, NASA named a mission after me, so it's the least I can do." So Gene came with his family, and I had the incredible honor of taking Gene into the clean room to meet his spacecraft. And yes, I did say, "Parker, meet Parker." And so it was just amazing, though, to watch the emotion on Gene's face as he stood in front of this incredible piece of technology that now bore his name. Not only that, but was going to go and do all the things that he had wanted to do for 60 years. And so he's standing there, and of course, all the engineers are kind of standing there going, hey, introduce me. And so I said, okay, come on up. And I introduced each of the engineers that were in the clean room that day. And they were just so excited. They were meeting Gene Parker. And Gene looked at them and he said, it's you guys that really deserve all the credit. All I did was write a paper. You guys are actually building this. And so he said this again to me later, all I did, Nikki, was write a paper. And I said, well, it's a pretty good paper, Gene, And he said, but you don't understand. If you get there and I'm wrong, I'll just write another paper. He said, however, if your calculations are wrong and that spacecraft gets there, it's game over. He said, you guys are the real heroes. And this was a theme that just went on and on with the totally giving, loving nature that Gene had. And so he joined us at the launch. As Eric said, NASA did want to make a big deal out of Gene being at the launch, and we loved having all of Gene's family with us. And I got the pleasure of standing behind Gene at the launch. And so, I'm cheering and screaming away and watching this mighty Delta IV Heavy lift that spacecraft up, And we looked down at Gene and I said, how you feeling? And he looked at me and very quietly he said, wow, we did it. And then I think obviously I was looking at him like I expected more, so he did give me a woohoo. And then, we stood there and we watched that rocket go up. And suddenly he looked at me and with I swear, with tears in his eyes, and he said, it's so sad, it's not coming back. And that really struck me, because anyone who's worked in a clean room for hours, days, months will tell you that spacecraft is part of your team. It becomes a person. It is the thing that is going to go and actually do the journey. And so every single one of us experiences extreme separation anxiety at that moment. You're so happy it's going into space, but oh my goodness, you're never going to see it again. And it was just amazing to me how Gene felt that, and he really did. And I also found last night, and I recommend, please go and read it. There is a letter from Gene Parker to Solar Probe. It is in National Geographic. If you haven't read it, it is absolutely beautiful. Please go and read it. And so, the launch was fantastic, obviously, and then, the data start to come. And I journeyed out. I wanted to celebrate the first anniversary, the milestone of Parker Solar Probe. And so I wanted to go out, show Gene some data, and also, get to share it with everybody. And so, as always, the amazing people at the University of Chicago said, absolutely, Nikki, we'll be there for you. So I get to Gene's home, and the camera crew's there. And, I walk in, I'm saying hello to everybody, and Gene's like, come here. And so, I go over and he said, never mind the cameras, show me the data. They'll catch up. And so I showed him some movies of the solar wind that we were taking with the white light imager, and some wiggly line plots that only, me and Gene would get excited about. But he looked and he was just like, wow, just, wow, that's what the corona looks like. And then he wickedly looked at me and said, have you found my nanoflares yet? And so we had a beautiful, beautiful tribute there. And then obviously, you've heard about all the amazing awards that Gene won, and the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, of course, is the Crawford Prize, which he won in 2020. And we all prepared excitedly to go to Sweden in April of 2020. COVID, as Eric already said, totally changed that for us. And so, it was delayed. And then 8:23 in the morning, on March 15th of this year, I got the phone call from Eric that I really did not want to get. And he told me very sadly that, Gene had passed. And so I spoke with Eric for a few minutes, hung up, and I cried. And I texted my boss, Thomas Sabukin, to tell him that Gene had died. And as I was doing this, my email pinged. And I got this email, and it came in, and it said, congratulations, you have been awarded the 2021 Carl Sagan Award. And my first response, by the way, was kind of similar to Gene. I was like, oh, they must want me to write a reference for somebody that's being nominated. And I had to read it again a couple of times. And as I was reading it, the clouds moved, and this sort of ray of sunshine hit my desk. And I could not shake the feeling that somehow this was Gene gifting this to me from heaven, like one last amazing thing that he would do for me. And so I had to text Eric, even though I knew he was, really busy and millions of things to do. And I thought, I just have to tell him. This is it's so profound. And I texted him, because I didn't want to call him. I knew he'd be busy. Well, Eric, being a Parker, called me back instantly. And he just very quietly, he said to me, Nikki, the good professor would be so proud of you. And I'm sure he is, just as I am very proud of him. And then, of course, we have to leave to go to Sweden. So it's April of 2022 now, we leave to go to Sweden. And the Parker family had gifted me once again with this incredible honor of asking me to give Gene's laureate lecture. Wow, what a career moment, giving a laureate lecture. And so it should have been so easy, and yet it was so hard. How do you characterize, how do you do justice to this? Not only that, but since Gene had passed, I had lost a friend and a mentor. Gene's family had lost a husband, a father, a grandfather, and humanity had lost a legend. And how do you do justice to that? And so I was sitting at Newark Airport, and I was really thinking, why did I say yes to this? I don't know what to do. And I called my best friend, and she said, take a deep breath and speak from the heart. And in fact, she gave me those words this morning as I was walking here too. And so I sat and I thought, how can I possibly get into one talk all the Gene-ness in the world? Very close to genius, you notice that. So I thought, well, there's so many great things to say. But what I chose to do was just really let the science speak for itself. Gene is named, as we all know, for Parker Solar Probe. And that mission continues to break records time and time again. It is the closest human-made object to the sun. It is the fastest human-made object. It's probably the hottest human-made object, too. We are hotter, faster, closer, we're Parker. It is the coolest, hottest mission under the sun. It is ultimate hotness. It is incredible. Parker Solar Probe is a one-of-a-kind mission, and it has done things that the world thought were not possible. Gene Parker is a one-of-a-kind man whose science breakthroughs did things that no one thought was possible, way ahead of his time, and yet every single one was proved right. In April of last year, Parker Solar Probe actually went beneath the Alphane surface, so it went into a region of the corona where no one has been before, nothing has been before, and it sent back data, the magnetic fields, the waves from that new region. In essence, Parker Solar Probe touched the sun, and so the mission named for Gene touched the sun. Gene Parker will forever touch the sun in the same way that he touches our hearts. Now, you've heard that Obviously, the solar wind paper is the one everybody cites, but there's a beautiful list of all of the amazing things he'd done. When I say Gene Parker is the father of heliophysics, he really is. Not only did he discover the solar wind and profoundly change the way we think about space and the way we think about stars, but he also correctly predicted that the radiation belts would change in response to this solar wind. He essentially predicted space weather before we even knew what space weather was. He correctly predicted that the solar wind would create a cavity that would protect the whole solar system as we orbit around the Milky Way. Every single one of those elements is part of heliophysics. So Gene's contribution to heliophysics and to astrophysics is just immeasurable. And with the profound changes that he made, it will continue to allow us to drive to just do bigger and bolder discoveries. Gene Parker was the father of heliophysics. And just as a loving dad does to his children, Gene Parker lifted humanity onto his shoulders, and he allowed us to touch a star.
That was beautiful. And I wanted to share a few things, but I think that was such a beautiful speech, Nikki, that I will let us share that personally in our reception. So I wanted just to share with all of you that this has been a wonderful moment, that we will continue this conversation in an informal basis on a reception. The reception will be at the Eckert Research Center. Just follow the scientists if you don't know where to go. We'll be happy to help. I wanted to also share with everybody that in tribute to Gene, this amazing legend that you heard about, we are naming a conference room in the Michelson Center for Physics, MCP 215, if you need to know. It will have his name, and it will keep inspiring many, many generations that will come, and hopefully they'll all learn what we learned and shared today. The room is in the same geographical location as Gene's former faculty office in what used to be called the Laboratory for Astrophysics and Space Research, a NASA-built building that was recently renovated into the Michelson Center for Physics. This will, keep future generations learning about the groundbreaking science and lasting legacy of Gene Parker's brilliance. But unfortunately, they might not know everything that we shared today. We'll try our best because the person is bigger than the science that we just heard about. So thank you so much. I will suggest that during the music, we let the family and the first row walk out first, and those that can then follow them to the reception, and we'll share some moments over there. Thank you.